CBS News, this is Jay Jones. It's time for the Columbia astronauts to get up. Reveille is set to sound in space at just about this hour. Ken Mattingly and Henry Hartsfield end the week-long space shuttle mission today. Columbia is to make a red-hot re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, and then the crew will fly the spacecraft to a landing on a concrete runway at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The first time a shuttle will touch down on concrete instead of the desert floor. President Reagan is due to be on hand for a star-spangled 4th of July welcome. Tens of thousands of onlookers are already there, camped overnight. As many as 400,000 people are expected by the time Columbia puts its wheels down on the runway at 12:10 p.m. Eastern Time. More when CBS News continues. CBS News, this is Jay Jones. The wake-up call has gone from Mission Control in Houston to the Columbia Space Shuttle high in orbit.
Good morning again. Good morning, Columbia. Houston with you through Yagadi for 4 more minutes. All right, sir. We're finishing our cleaning stuff up here.
Astronauts Mattingly and Hartsfield are straightening up to prepare for today's return from space. Columbia is due to touch down on a concrete runway at Edwards Air Force Base in California at 12:10 p.m. Eastern Time. President Reagan is expected to be there, as well as nearly 500,000 other onlookers. More when CBS News continues.
The orbiter is being cleaned up and checked out, and everything seems set for Columbia to come home just after noon Eastern Time today. I'm Dave Barrett. The astronauts will have their last meal in weightlessness. Dried peaches, beef patties, scrambled eggs, bran flakes, cocoa, and orange juice. Sounds like brunch. And then get set for the return to California. How about the numbers game on this final test flight? ABC's Irv Chapman explains what Ken Mattingly and Hank Hartsfield handled during their week in space.
CBS News, this is Jay Jones. Well, May weather is expected to be ideal today on the Mojave Desert in California for the return of the Space Shuttle Columbia. Astronauts Mattingly and Hartsfield are busy with final preparations right now for their fiery re-entry into the atmosphere and touchdown on a concrete runway at Edwards Air Force Base. Flight Director Chuck Lewis says this final of 4 test missions has shown that the Space Shuttle is ready for its operational phase. Today's landing will be part of a July 4th celebration with President Reagan on hand to greet the returning astronauts. Columbia's wheels are expected to be down at 12:10 p.m. Eastern Time.
CBS News, this is Paul Lockwood. Henry Hartsfield and Ken Mattingly are now in the final hours of their space shuttle flight. The astronauts were up well before the wake-up sounds of This Is My Country were piped on board ship from Mission Control in Houston. Mattingly and Hartsfield are now carrying out a number of chores that are necessary before the Columbia returns to Earth. About 6 hours from now at Edwards Air Force Base in California, President Reagan plans to be there to welcome the crew.
Now, this update from ABC News. I'm John, including the President and the First Lady will be on hand at Edwards Air Base in California about 5 hours from now to watch the touchdown of the Space Shuttle Columbia. At Edwards, Peter Cleveland reports there's still a lot to be done.
Astronauts Ken Mattingly and Hank Hartsfield were awakened a little after midnight California time. They're now busy doing all the last-minute things that need to be done before they close the payload bay doors and get ready for their landing here at Edwards Air Force Base. President Reagan is scheduled to arrive about 25 minutes before they touch down. Weather here is expected to be ideal, temperature in the 70s, but light winds may prevent their crosswind landing, so it looks like Mattingly and Hartsfield will set Columbia down on the concrete runway here at Edwards Air Force Base. Peter Cleveland, ABC News, Edwards Air Force Base, California.
ABC News live coverage of Columbia's landing begins shortly before noon Eastern Time.
This is Pastor Emery with broadcast number.
Hi. High is the flag on the 4th of July. Higher if you're Ken Mattingly and Hank Hartsfield. The two space shuttle astronauts are taking their final whirls around the world before swooping back to Earth to land at Edwards Air Force Base in California some 4 hours from now. Houston piped up some appropriate 4th of July music to wake up the astronauts this morning. Right now, everything is going by the book for the touchdown. Nearly 500,000 people have camped out at Edwards to see the event. President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan will fly in to welcome the astronauts.
From ABC News, I'm Bob Windsor. A 4th of July hero's welcome in store for astronauts Ken Mattingly and Hank Hartsfield, now going over their final checklist for re-entry and landing at California's Edwards Air Force Base about 3 hours from now. ABC's Irv Chapman is standing by at Space Shuttle Control in Houston. Irv, what's happening in space now?
Well, they closed the cargo doors aboard Columbia, Bob, and told Mission Control they were latched tight. I'm not surprised, astronaut communicator Brewster Shaw commented. I knew you wouldn't be, Commander Ken Mattingly replied. We weren't either. As a precaution, Columbia flew a couple of orbits with its top side, where the doors are, facing the sun. After experience on 2 successive flights showed the doors won't close if they're too cold. Mattingly and Henry Hartsfield are now in their pressure suits, carrying on with landing preparations slightly ahead of schedule, Bob.
ABC's Irv Chapman in Houston. President Reagan will be in California's Mojave Desert for the touchdown of the Columbia, and ABC's John Lyons tells us the landing site will be a final test.
Right now, the weather guessers are calling for clear skies and a light wind out of the west at landing time. If that holds for a few more hours, Columbia will become the first spaceship ever to land on a regular runway like a jetliner. But if the wind picks up, NASA may get answers it wants to a very important question. How well does the space shuttle land with the wind blowing across from one side or the other, not straight down the runway? When space shuttles start landing at the Kennedy Space Center next year, NASA expects they'll almost always have to land in a crosswind. Technicians aren't expecting this procedure to be any problem, but they'd like to make their first crosswind landing at a big, wide lake bed just in case. Whichever runway they use, it's expected there'll be about 500,000 people out here to watch the music, Bob.
That's John Lyons at Edwards Air Force Base, California. ABC News will carry the landing of Columbia beginning at 11:54 Eastern Time. I'll have more after this.
CBS News, I'm Deborah Potter. Everything's going smoothly aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia today as the astronauts prepare for landing about 2 hours from now. Commander Ken Mattingly and pilot Henry Hartsfield got to sleep a bit later than usual this morning, waking up to a fitting 4th of July fanfare, the appropriately patriotic song, This Is My Country. We get more on the final hours of the mission from the Johnson Space Center in Houston and correspondent Christopher Glenn.
Right on the timeline is the way Mission Control describes astronauts Mattingly and Hartsfield as they work down the checklist toward the all-important deorbit burn, little more than an hour away now. They're in their re-entry suits. They've successfully closed and latched the big payload bay doors, and as the time to start down draws near, they'll turn Columbia so they're flying upside down and backwards, tail first. Then, at the proper moment, the main engines will fire, thrusting against the orbital speed of the ship for nearly 3 minutes, enough to change that speed by 215 miles an hour and drag them out of orbit. Because of the path Columbia will be following on the last orbit, all this will take place out of range of communications over the South Indian Ocean, and it will be a long, anxious 20 minutes before they report in on how it went through the Guam tracking station. After that, the customary blackout period as they pass through the hottest part of the descent, and then onto the runway at Edwards Air Force Base and a spectacular 4th of July landing before President Reagan and a crowd of 400,000 other people. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
2 hours now for Space Shuttle Columbia's landing in California, and everything is still proceeding right on schedule. KTRH's Wayne Dolcefino reports from the Johnson Space Center.
An hour from now, the big toboggan ride begins at more than 170 nautical miles in space. Astronauts Mattingly and Hartsfield will activate the orbital maneuvering rockets, sending Columbia dropping 300 feet per second. During the hour re-entry period, the speed of the shuttle will drop from 24 times the speed of sound to less than 250 miles an hour before touchdown, probably on the concrete runway 22 in California at Edwards Air Force Base. President Reagan will be there, and at least more than 300,000 people along with him. The Space Shuttle Challenger there, too. After that, the crew will come to Ellington Air Force Base to arrive at 6 o'clock, 2 hours after the Space Shuttle Challenger arrives in Houston. The public's invited there as well. All is well on board, the crew well rested, and now dressed for their trip home. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
CBS News, this is Paul Lockwood. With only a little more than an hour remaining in their space shuttle flight, astronauts Ken Mattingly and Henry Hartsfield are about to execute a crucial maneuver. This in advance of their scheduled landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Christopher Glenn at the Johnson Space Center in Houston starts our report on the shuttle mission.
The descent begins in about 9.5 minutes when the astronauts fire up both of their orbital maneuvering engines, the big ones they use to change the orbital path while they're up in space. They'll be flying upside down and backwards when that burn starts. It'll go on for about 2.5 minutes, slowing them down by about 210 miles an hour. That's not much of a change from 16,000 miles an hour, but it's enough to drag them down out of orbit. Then as their track across the Pacific continues, they'll perform a kind of half gainer to bring Columbia around to a belly down, nose up tilted attitude, ready for the hot part of the ride as the atmosphere gets denser and denser into the customary blackout period and then on into Edwards Air Force Base. My colleague Reed Collins is standing by out there, and I understand there's a few other folks out there too, Reed.
Indeed there are. A convoy of 28 vehicles has wound its way out to positions alongside runway 22. That's the concrete strip that looks more and more like the landing site for Shuttle 4. A crosswind is blowing at runway 17, but it doesn't seem to be strong enough to give the desired landing test. It is stiff enough, though, to blow hundreds and hundreds of American flags straight out from their standards on the hangars of the Dryden Test Center here and in the hands of thousands of visitors ranged round this site. A banner on one hangar says, "Welcome back, Columbia." Next to it is the old Enterprise, which will provide the backdrop for President Reagan's greeting of the astronauts. Down the ramp away is the new orbiter, the Challenger, secured on the back of its 747 transport plane. All the orbiters are here for the July 4th homecoming of Columbia. Reed Collins, CBS News at Edwards Air Force Base.
We just made another pass to 2-2. The mapping lights are now on. Both the right outboard one is dimmer than the other two when the white light is on. Copy that. It has a dim out. The right outboard one is dim, and I don't know if you need to tell TK that or not. Okay. The wind has picked up just a little bit. Tower's calling 230 at 10. I don't know what you guys are reading down there on the surface, but it doesn't look like it's picked up very much. It may pick up a little more in the time that, between now and the time they come out of blackout, my guess is, but it probably won't pick up 2 or 3 knots. We copy.
Control, it's 7 days, 29 minutes mission elapsed time. Columbia is about 30 seconds away from acquisition through Guam. We'll stand by for a report on the deorbit burn.
Columbia, Houston through Guam for 6 minutes. Configure AOS. Got it. All 3 APUs look good. Thank you, sir.
This is Shuttle Control. We're showing a perigee of 0.8 nautical miles, so the burn was obviously very good. Columbia will land on runway 22. 7.5 minutes away from entry interface.
a.m. Central Daylight Time, STS-4, NASA Broadcast News Service report from the NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston. A note to editors follows this status report. The re-entry and landing procedures being followed by the crew of Columbia are right on the timeline. The orbit burn is set to begin at 10:10 a.m. Central Daylight Time. A 2-minute burn of the orbital maneuvering system engines will slow Columbia by 308.8 feet per second and initiate re-entry. Columbia's flight path will carry it across the coast of California between Santa Barbara and
Shuttle control, all systems aboard Columbia look very good.
Scattered clouds between 10 and 20,000 feet, visibility 20 miles, landing site temperature 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind speed 8 knots from the southwest. The 8-knot wind speed is below the required 11-knot wind speed for the desired crosswinds landing on runway.
Columbia, Houston, no Delta T required. You are go for maneuvers, all systems look good.
Columbia, roger.
Gregory Boat at the NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston. Our next status report is scheduled for 1/2 hour after landing or sooner as conditions warrant.
Columbia, Houston, 30 seconds LOS. Check wideband mission to continuous.
This is the 9:15 a.m. Central Daylight Time STS-4 NASA Broadcast News Service report.
We'll see over the States. Have a good downhill trip. The winds are 230 at 10 on the surface.
All right, sir, thank you.
And configure LOS.
Welcome.
Columbia by 308.8 feet per second and initiate re-entry. Columbia's flight path will carry it across the coast of California between Santa Barbara and Ventura as it speeds on to Edwards Air Force Base on California's high desert. The 6 a.m. Central Daylight Time weather forecast for Edwards at the 11 miles. Landing site temperature.
This is Shuttle Control. Guam has lost of signal now with Columbia. Columbia committed to enter the Earth's atmosphere in 3 minutes, 3 seconds. We may have a short bit of acquisition through Hawaii in about 9.5 minutes. It's possible that we'll get 1 minute's worth of acquisition time there, and we'll stand by it to see whether we do or not. Touchdown clock showing 32 minutes, 10 seconds to touchdown on runway 22.
NASA 913, Houston, radio check.
Loud and clear, Houston, Chase.
Radio 5 by, guy.
Roger. Still, is it firm now? It's 2-2?
That's affirmative.
Roger.
NASA 946, Houston.
946, go.
Roger, sir. Do you have any further updates?
Oh, we're just about to make a pass to 2-2. We'll let you know if anything's different.
Okay, we're ALS in 8 minutes.
Okay, the last pass, the MLS was working just fine.
We copy.
Shuttle Control, Columbia should be entering the Earth's atmosphere now.
Things continue to go near perfect on this 4th test and final test flight of the Space Shuttle Columbia. Back down to John Lyons at Edwards Air Force Base in California.
Bob Walker there now in radar contact with Columbia, and everything appears to be going very, very well. 12 minutes, 33 seconds away from a landing here on the lake bed. And the ground controllers are now speaking with the chase planes that are up there in the sky that will escort them on down. Everything is going very well. And let's go to Peter Cleveland. Take a little look around, Peter.
You know, John, this has got to be probably the biggest 4th of July celebration that I've ever seen. There's close to 500,000 people 6 miles across the lake base, the lake bed from us. There are about 400,000. The Columbia now 10 miles in the air. The people here American flags everywhere, patriotic songs being sung. The President and Mrs. Reagan are sitting about 3 miles from us, waiting for the landing with several of the Columbia astronauts. Mr. Reagan in a beige suit, Mrs. Reagan in a white skirt and red jacket, sort of a very patriotic dress for her. And do we think we can just now begin to pick up Columbia? Yes, we do, on a tracking telescope camera picture. The Santa Ynez Peak camera is showing us a picture of the shuttle as she is getting closer to the California coast, 164,000 feet high. John Lyon?
And everything continues to go very, very well. The spacecraft is a little bit higher than pre-programmed and a little bit slightly off course. That is no problem. It is well within the capability of Columbia to bring it on down in here to the Edwards Air Force Base. Let's listen to NASA right now. Some of the voices you'll hear through here, the public affairs officer is Jack Riley. Brewster Shaw.
They've just talked to them, John. Just talked to T.K. Mattingly.
Okay, that was Brewster Shaw in Houston. He's an astronaut. He was speaking to the crew, saying that they are go for some of the test maneuvers they have to do. That voice you just heard there, Jack Riley. He's the voice of the mission control in Houston. 10 minutes, 40 seconds away. Coming up on the West Coast right now.
And with the weather as good as it is, John, they're going to have a gorgeous view of the California coast coming in, and as they hurtle in over Santa Barbara and head here to Edwards Air Force Base, not a cloud in the sky almost.
They'll certainly have a tremendous view of this lake bed as they come past the mountains, and that's
Houston, take TAC in.
That means that they're going to use their important navigational instruments to make a pinpoint landing here on the lake bed. Let's go to Bob Walker in New York.
Astronaut John Young, the chief shuttle astronaut and the man who commanded the first shuttle mission, has been up flying around this morning in the shuttle training aircraft doing...
Of course, we understand that this time we'll see the landing gear come down a little sooner than last time. Came down pretty close to the wire there.
That was a tight one last time around.
Of course, at 380-something feet, the automatic gear will come down, but we understand the crew might take them down earlier. Of course, bringing you up to date, the deorbit maneuver began just about 55 minutes ago. A shuttle was traveling 170 nautical miles above the Earth over the Pacific Ocean.
185 miles away from the landing strip, the concrete one-way they're hoping to land on.
The big graphite bird, very visual now. The chase planes keeping alongside. Pictures taken from the California mountain peak. Things going very, very well. We are just about 11 minutes away from touchdown. Columbia sort of making a bang to the left. Of course, it will be making a final left turn on its final runway approach to runway 22. The concrete runway, they have 15,000 feet, although it's a bit of a psychological hurdle, Doug Miller, primarily because when you land on a dry lake bed, you can afford to make a few mistakes and still make it. And, of course, this is something they're going to have to get used to. Flight number 7, they're supposed to...
disregard the evap out.
Supposed to land at Kennedy on a runway that's surrounded on 3 sides by a swamp. And so I guess it's better now that they learn how to do it.
They had hoped to do some tests with crosswind landing, but the winds just aren't sufficient for that right now. So they'll be landing on that concrete runway.
Big plane now making its way.
Approaching the coast at 112,000 feet. Mach 4.7.
That's right on schedule. Coming a little bit south of Santa Barbara, a special treat for those folks. Of course, about 300,000 folks waiting at Edwards Air Force Base.
Some 200,000 expected out at Ellington to see the astronauts return and also take a look at the Challenger passing through Houston.
And of course, as we mentioned earlier, the President will be making some remarks.
106,000 feet, Mach 4, range to go 110 miles.
It's hard to believe that just about 30 minutes ago, Columbia was traveling at 24 times the speed of sound. That's what I call braking capability.
Dropping like a rock.
Atmosphere will do that to you. Ionization, big, strong temperatures. The tiles, though, which have performed so well, at least on re-entry during the first 3 flights. And there was some concern before this flight took off because of that hailstorm that happened 17 hours before, as Chuck Lewis talked about earlier in the program.
Columbia systems and control looking good.
Columbia, Houston, positive seats. Energy is converged.
Now 7 minutes, 30 seconds away from landing.
Your radio is almost unusable.
A mass of humanity at Edwards Air Force Base. Must be pretty tough, hot day out there, I'm sure, and of course it's well worth the wait. Real special July 4th.
93,000 feet now at an altitude where the ejection seats could be used if necessary.
Of course, this is the last time. The ejection seats will be on board for the next flight. They're going to make room for 2 more crewmen, so the ejection seats will go.
Columbia, Houston, take air data.
I'm sure the folks over in New Mexico, in Tularosa, New Mexico, are glad they are landing over there at White Sands. They had a big crowd there last time.
Of course, though, when they landed at White Sands, Doug, that gypsum sand sure did a little bit of damage. It was tough cleaning it out. They had to replace some rocket thrusters.
Some of the maneuvering rockets and so on.
85,000 feet.
We can see Robert Crippen standing there on the presidential viewing stand. He's looking around, looking up in the sky. What's he looking for there?
I wonder. Looking for the shuttle. Joe Engel and Dick Truly there also. Of course, Crippen will be going back up on the STS number 7 with the first woman shuttle
Columbia, Houston,
astronaut.
we'd like to pass the BFS transfer. Roger.
Looks like we're going to have some really nice pictures in there. The visibility looks fairly high.
Probes have been deployed by the shuttle. 2 little probes, 1 on each side. The air data system. Again, another navigational aid to make sure Columbia is right on track. Basically, though, the Columbia could be brought home all the way.
Columbia's crew still conducting the maneuvers to aid aerodynamic data.
But the ship has the capability, Doug, of coming home all the way automatically.
72,000 feet, Mach 1.8, 44 miles to go.
Approaching subsonic speed. That's when the approach and landing phase takes over, basically the final approach. They'll be making the left turn, which pilots prefer. They'll be able to see out the window, sort of get a shot at the runway as they come around, make that sweeping left turn. It was a pretty big cross range for Columbia. It's about 580 miles cross range. That's a pretty long distance. So obviously the navigational aids have to be extremely operable. Of course, like everything else in this mission, there's so much redundancy, Doug. There's so many things that could go wrong, and they could still find another way to come home.
Looks like we're seeing some shots. Is that from a chase plane or is that from the ground? It's kind of hard to tell.
Looks like it might be from the
Columbia now
ground.
about 5 minutes from touchdown at 61,000 feet, Mach 1.3.
Landing a little ahead of schedule. It's
Columbia, Houston, cameras.
Columbia now traveling 1.3 times the speed of sound.
Of course, it'll be landing at a speed of just under 250 miles per hour.
It's hard to believe that they break that speed so darn quickly. Just a few minutes ago, traveling 24 times the speed of sound as they re-enter the atmosphere.
And the incline is so much steeper than a commercial airplane.
Columbia at Mach 1.1 now at 51,000 feet, range 27 miles.
This is the part of the mission that I've always found to be the most precise. They seem to do this very well. They seem to take off and land exceptionally well.
Right down the runway, right down the stripe.
And this time it seemed like everything in between went pretty well, too. I think they have to be very happy with the way the vehicle has performed. Of course, there have been little problems. The payload bay doors had warped at one point. They fixed that.
At 44,000 feet.
Approach and landing,
range
taking over.
23 miles.
But again, they have to be very pleased. It's ready for operational flight.
Right.
1,000 feet, approaching the hack.
The problems they had, most of the problems were the sort of thing they anticipated having because of the nature of this being a test flight. For example, they wanted to do the thermal test, which is what warped the payload bay doors. They think they've settled that problem. They think they know how to solve that warping by doing that barbecue roll, rotating the space shuttle like a hot dog on a spit to expose it evenly to the sun.
The astronauts now starting to point to the President. Columbia making that steep incline, 22 times steeper than a commercial airline.
Columbia now visible from the ground.
Speed 258
You can see the President pointing into the sky. He can see it, and so can Mrs. Reagan. Everyone on the presidential viewing stand pointing up into the sky. Look at that picture.
Like a bullet coming down. Columbia. It's a good show, they say. And it's a beautiful show.
28,000 feet.
A special July 4th. Of course, next year they're talking about a July 4th nighttime launch.
Surface winds 240 at 12.
Now we're seeing the chase plane viewing Columbia from upstairs. There were 4 chase planes.
Boy, they're very clear over there at Edwards.
Columbia just about 3 minutes away. About 40 minutes after landing, they'll be getting out of the ship after everything has been secured. They'll be talking to President Reagan, and then, as we said, about 12:45.
20,000 feet at 286 knots.
At 12:45, the President will be making his speech, and supposedly will talk about a permanent manned presence in space. We understand there'll be no specific comments in terms of exactly what that would entail, although there has been talk in the last week about a manned space station.
18,000 feet now.
18,000 feet. Microwave scan beam landing system, the auto land now in effect.
TK surface winds 240 at 12.
Thank you.
2 minutes to touchdown.
Turning into a heading lined up with the runway now.
Looking very, very pretty.
14,000 feet.
We're now seeing the nose of Columbia, the black nose now pointing toward us.
Airspeed 264.
Visibility is very nice. A very clear picture from the underside.
Columbia on final and looking very
It looks
good.
like there's not too much damage to the underside.
12,000 feet.
Chase planes on both sides, guiding Columbia back. Sort of hard to tell the difference between the shuttle and the chase planes when they're just driving around. It looks a lot bigger.
And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the shuttle that after it's come in,
9,600 feet.
exposed to the heat of the atmosphere, and before it left, they look so clean.
Just about a minute or so.
Into auto land guidance now.
We're in auto land guidance, as we said, basically.
We'll stay in auto land guidance until 2,500 feet.
Of course, eventually, Doug, they want to use auto land all the way down. They may do that on the next mission. Of course, they were looking for the crosswinds, which is something I think they're going to want to get before they make a landing at Kennedy. Eventually, all the landings will be at Kennedy or Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, and of course, we'll see then what role the Johnson Space Center will play. There's been talk that the role will be shortened, lessened during the next few years.
Indeed, there have been rumors that the entire manned space effort could be controlled out of another base entirely.
Of course, interesting relationship this first time with the military, and although they said everything went along pretty well, there was times when we could tell that there was some tension between the crew and the folks in Sunnyvale, California, although when it was all over, they said, guys, it was great. You guys did a real great job. The landing gear is down.
Landing gear down now.
Let's listen to mission control. Columbia
now less than 30 seconds away from touchdown.
Gears down and locked.
Coming in for a touchdown. Just a few feet off the ground.
The back wheels.
Looks as though the back wheels have made contact.
Just about sort of like floating right on top of the surface. Of course, we'll see the front wheel come down. Robert Crippen is just going all right.
There it is. It's down. She's on the ground. Columbia, the fourth test flight of the Space Shuttle Columbia, now on the ground.
That was a very smooth landing. Of course,
very smooth.
It popped up the
Shuttle
nose a bit.
control here. The unofficial landing time, 7 days, 1 hour, 9 minutes, 40 seconds.
A little bit early.
To repeat, the unofficial landing time, 7 days, 1 hour, 9 minutes, 40 seconds.
It was unusual seeing that landing on concrete. We expected to see a little bit of dust kicking up. We were expecting something to kick up behind it. Nothing like that. Nothing at all. Very smooth.
They had cleaned the runway off, trying to get all the pebbles off yesterday at Edwards Air Force Base. Columbia making a very good, looks like a very quick stop. They had 15,000 feet of runway, and it's hard to see how much they used, but it doesn't look like they used all that much. They were supposed to come down about 2,500 feet down, but they've proven and they could land on concrete, and as I said before, it's a psychological hurdle that they had to get over.
It's interesting to note how the shuttle, well, the first time around, looked so darn clean, looked so lily white, but now you can see it's kind of getting a little bit scuffed up from all of these journeys into space. President Reagan standing there on the viewing platform. This is Reagan deciding.
You get a cabin or PPO2 message, disregard.
Okay, we got one couple of those.
So now, as the Columbia rolls to a stop, recovery crew convoy is supposed to be rolling in. The crew is to be turning off its auxiliary power units and turning on a cooling system. Also there to power down the engines of the Columbia, those rockets that maneuvered them around in space. They're supposed to be powering those down to make sure there is not some sort of an accident on the ground. After that, crews in special escape suits that we talked about earlier will be walking up to it, rolling up to make sure that there's no problem. There's the convoy moving in. We can see the convoy rolling toward the Columbia right now.
Columbia now home, Doug, and I guess we should talk to the folks real quick about what's going to be happening this afternoon. After the President's remarks this afternoon about 12:45, the Space Shuttle Challenger, perched on top of that 747, will be taking off for a special July 4th celebration here in Houston. It will be landing at Ellington Air Force Base just about 4 o'clock or so, and at about 6 o'clock, the astronauts, Mattingly and Hartsfield, just on the ground just an hour or two, and they'll be back up in the air again, heading to Houston, and they'll make some speeches there, and it should be a big occasion. Of course, there's going to be an awful lot of folks out there. We've had estimates up to 200, 300,000. It's hard to predict. Of course, so with the July 4th and the beautiful weather here, I'm sure we'll have a big crowd. Just pointing out that Ellington Air Force Base is off Highway 3, and only the front main gate will be open. If you're coming down from Houston off Interstate 45, you will see an Ellington Air Force Base exit. Just follow that road down, and you'll hit it, although we expect some traffic jams down there, so I would suggest that the earlier you leave, the better. But again, Doug Miller, wrapping up here. Shuttle mission test flight is over. The test phase is finished, and although it's not really a definite transition, they're still going to be doing testing on this vehicle for a long time. There's still some things they don't know about it. But all the flight directors, all the folks here say they're ready to go operational.
Ready to go operational with Space Shuttle Mission 5, which is scheduled to launch a few months from now. And, well, the first DoD payload carried up, the first military payload carried up on this mission, and some interesting outgrowths of that. A little bit of tension with the crew, as we said, and a lot of cryptic conversations coming out of the shuttle because of their dealings with that DoD payload. But all in all, it was a very, very smooth mission and a very smooth landing this morning out at Edwards.
It was called the cleanest flight yet, and the landing was perhaps the cleanest part of it. It was beautiful from the deorbit maneuver all the way down to the ground. The gear came down, shuttle just floating onto the surface of the concrete runway at Edwards Air Force Base in California. We certainly have enjoyed bringing you this live coverage of the return of Columbia. Hope you'll join us out at Ellington Air Force Base later this afternoon. For Doug Miller, I'm Wayne Dolcefino, live from the Johnson Space Center.
CBS News.
Columbia, Houston, welcome back to Earth. That was beautiful. That's quite a ride.
Quite a ride, the 7-day flight of the Space Shuttle Columbia, its fourth and final test mission. This is Frank Cittipani, and with a report on the picture-perfect landing, here's Reed Collins at Edwards Air Force Base in California.
Columbia swept Edwards with a twin sonic boom calling card, then dropped out of the eastern hills and down to runway 22 for the first landing from orbit on a concrete runway. President and Mrs. Reagan watched from a special reviewing stand with other astronauts who have flown the shuttle. She laced her fingers together as the Columbia touched the runway. Crowds gathered here on the ramps in front of the hangars, waved small flags, and shouted in exultation. 500,000 more watched from trailers and tents pitched on the perimeters of this base. Once stopped, it takes at least 40 minutes to go through the post-flight checklists before Mattingly and Hartsfield can begin to think about getting out and greeting the president, who's going to make some remarks here, which NASA is as interested in hearing as it was the voices of Mattingly and Hartsfield coming home. Reed Collins, CBS News at Edwards Air Force Base.
News, this is Frank Cittipani. The shuttle Columbia has returned home safely, greeted by President Reagan and thousands of July 4th celebrants as it ended its fourth successful test flight in space. Reed Collins is at the touchdown site, Edwards Air Force Base in California.
1 hour, 50 minutes ago, Columbia came soaring in from the east and settled onto runway 22 in fine shape. The fourth voyage ending on the 4th. President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan went right out to the shuttle stopping place on the runway, greeted Mattingly and Hartsfield as they came down from the orbiter. Mr. Reagan got an astronaut's cap as a souvenir. Then the astronauts went for a post-flight physical, and the Reagans headed back to the ceremonial site where the schedule has come somewhat unraveled. The new shuttle, the Challenger, has now been taxied out to the end of a runway where its Transport 747 is waiting word to take off and fly to Houston. The Air Force and the Navy bands have been vamping with music while the schedule goes awry. 'Twas ever thus, split-second timing in space simply cannot be achieved in the 1G in which most of us happen to live. Reed Collins, CBS News, Edwards Air Force Base.
I'm George Herman. Space Shuttle Columbia is back on Earth, and President Reagan was there to greet the returning astronauts.
Happy 4th of July, and you know this has got to beat firecrackers.
Earlier, the shuttle had made a perfect textbook landing right down the middle of the strip. CBS News correspondent Nelson Benton at Edwards Air Force Base looks forward to new policies following the end of the shuttle test flights.
President Reagan welcomed Columbia astronauts Mattingly and Hartsfield home before thousands of flag-waving Americans who watched their perfect touchdown at Edwards Air Force Base. Mr. Reagan praised them, their spacecraft, and he spoke of horizons still ahead.
The space shuttle will open up even more impressive possibilities, permitting us to use the near weightlessness and near perfect vacuum of space to produce special alloys, metals, glasses, crystals, and biological materials impossible to manufacture on Earth. Similarly, in the area of national security, our space systems have opened unique opportunities for peace by providing advanced methods of verifying strategic arms control agreements.
The President also announced the National Space Policy, which includes the development and deployment of an anti-satellite system. Nelson Denton, CBS News, Edwards Air Force Base.
Mr. Reagan also took time off during his speech to order the nation's second space shuttle, the Challenger, to take off from Edwards on its way to Houston for final testing. And the Challenger, riding piggyback on a Boeing 747, roared over the stands as the astronauts of the Columbia's fourth and last test flight were greeting the crowd. More news in a minute.
Edwards Air Force Base in California, but things probably won't be so smooth at Ellington Air Force Base this evening. A crowd of 200 to 300,000 people are expected to turn out to greet the astronauts when they arrive in Houston about 6 this evening. And the Columbia's sister ship, the Challenger, will be arriving about 5. If you want to see either, the only road you can use to get to the main gate will be on Farm Road 1959, leading from the Gulf Freeway. State Highway 3 is closed to northbound traffic at Farm Road 2351.
CBS News, I'm George Herman. America entered its new space age today as the Space Shuttle Columbia touched down in a letter-perfect landing on a concrete runway, thus ending its test flights. This first landing on a paved surface opens the way to landings at Cape Canaveral near the launch pad, and thus a new operational status for the shuttle. CBS News correspondent Reed Collins listened to a policy speech at Edwards Air Force Base by President Reagan and later attended a post-flight news conference. He gives us this report.
Many in NASA were hoping that President Reagan would announce support for a fifth orbiter and/or a permanent space station, the two items highest on the NASA wish list. In his speech, Mr. Reagan mentioned neither. The Shuttle Assistant Administrator, General James Abramson, refuses to voice disappointment.
The real question, of course, is one of national priorities, and we do understand that. So we feel that at this point, this kind of a statement is a strong statement of support, and we're delighted with that.
Well, just to follow up, if you'd be very pleased by something you didn't get, what is your reaction to not getting it?
We're hopeful. He supported us. That's the key element.
General Abramson went on to say that without a fifth orbiter, it may be difficult down the road for NASA to meet both its military and civilian space commitments. Reed Collins, CBS News at Edwards Air Force Base.
Of the new era of space development, saying so far we've only peeked over the edge of the new technology. And he stressed the military as well as the civilian uses of space to be opened up by the shuttle. Now this.
Washington Air Force Base this afternoon to see the newest space shuttle and the astronauts who returned home today. The Challenger is scheduled to stop at Ellington around 5:20 on its way to Florida, and the astronauts will be getting here about 6. The only way to get into the base to see the astronauts and the shuttle is to use the main gate on Farm Road 1959 leading from the Gulf Freeway. Texas Highway 3 will be closed to northbound traffic at Farm Road 2351 and to southbound traffic at Farm Road 2553. Texas continues to lead the nation in the number of people killed in...
This is KTRH Houston. CBS News, this is Frank Sebapani. The Space Shuttle Columbia made a smooth as silk landing on a Sunday concrete runway at Edwards Air Force Base today, bringing the fourth and final shuttle test flight to a successful conclusion. President and Mrs. Reagan were among the estimated 500,000 people on hand to cheer astronauts Mattingly and Hartsfield. Afterward, the President spoke about the future of the space program, including its military aspects.
In the area of national security, our space systems have opened unique opportunities for peace by providing advanced methods of verifying strategic arms control agreements. The shuttle we just saw land carried two kinds of payloads, one funded entirely by private industry, and the other related to our national security, sponsored by the Air Force. This versatility of the Columbia and her sister ships will serve the American people well.
The president did not give NASA a hoped-for green light to build a manned space station. As for Columbia, its next mission comes in November when it hauls 2 communication satellites into space.
In California to watch the Space Shuttle Columbia land, completing its final test flight. Mutual correspondent Jim Thompson talked with some of them.
Oh, I thought it was really neat, really exciting.
It was great. First time I've ever seen one. This is the third one I've seen land here now. I'm stationed out here at Edwards. I thought it was great again. I got goosebumps. Loved it. It was exciting when we seen when the sonic boom came, and then we seen the sound waves through the sky. That's when we all got goosebumps.
President Reagan was on hand to personally welcome the astronauts back after their full week in space, and he compared them to Western pioneers.
They and the other astronauts have shown the world that Americans still have the know-how and Americans still have the true grit that tackled a savage wilderness.
However, some NASA people were disappointed the president did not call for building a space station, something they've been pushing for. This is news from Mutual Radio. Frank Gentry reporting.
CBS News. This is Judy Muller. The astronauts from the Space Shuttle Columbia are back at the Space Center in Houston after earlier bringing their craft to a perfect landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California. As the Columbia neared its landing strip, the brand new shuttle, the Challenger, atop a 747 jumbo jet, lifted off for its trip to Cape Canaveral. As the astronauts were addressing the crowd in Houston, the Challenger put in another appearance. Christopher Glenn was at the scene.
He's still up pretty high, and he's coming pretty close to the reviewing stand at this point. Following this plane is Fitz Fulton, captain of the 747, and he is going to do a spectacular flyby, and this crowd of astronauts and their families standing in the reviewing area here with us knows what's going to happen, and they're very appreciative of it. Here he comes. What a sight. Big white and black shuttle, small though large against the greater bulk of the red, white, blue, and silver 747. Oh, magnificent. Great sight. Going all the way down the entire length of this quite lengthy runway. The crowd strewn out alongside of it. The cheers and applause, of course, rippling down the line as the big plane flies slowly by.
Christopher Glenn reporting from Houston. President Reagan, who was on hand to witness the landing, called it a 4th of July present to remember. More after this.
It's been a busy afternoon at Ellington Air Force Base, where thousands of Houstonians turned out to see the Space Shuttle Columbia astronauts return home. They also got a chance to see the Columbia's sister ship, the Challenger. KTRH's Doug Miller is at Ellington and has this live report.
Just 6 hours after they returned from their week in space, astronauts Ken Mattingly and Hank Hartsfield returned to Houston, home once again after their week-long journey on the Space Shuttle Columbia. They're providing a dramatic backdrop for their 4th of July homecoming. The second space shuttle, the second in the fleet of America's space shuttles, the Challenger, piggybacked on a NASA 747 jet. As the jet engines roared in the background, Mattingly spoke glowingly of the Challenger, saying that its limits are only the limits of our imaginations. Well, the Challenger is up on top of the 747 right now. The crowds have been much, much smaller than anticipated. Right now, it's very easy to get within just a few dozen yards of the Challenger, and there's plenty of time to see it before the sun sets. The Challenger sitting on top of the 747, a beautiful sight for the crowd here at Ellington, a much smaller crowd than anticipated. Reporting live from the Ellington Air Force Base, this is Doug Miller, KTRH News.
Fireworks displays will wrap up 4th of July activities in Houston tonight. There will be displays at Greens Point Mall, Herman Park, and Sharpstown Mall. All three begin at 9 o'clock.